Well, it's 4 o'clock, and this is the Great War Discussion Group. I'm Charlie Van Way, and our presenter for today is Lee Denniston. You're looking at his computer screen, and his subject is propaganda in World War I. You know, propaganda goes back a very long way. There is a quotation from Asclepius, the great Greek physician, that goes as follows: God is not averse to deception in a just cause. Participants in all wars ever since have maintained that that is the absolute truth. We are currently being exposed to a war in which the two sides have radically different views of the war, and our own media, of course, which is 100% accurate, is presenting one side, while the other side is being presented by the Russians and their allies. So this is an especially timely lecture. Lee, thanks for getting all this together, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, as Charlie just said, we live today surrounded by propaganda to the point that as often as not, we don't even pay much attention to it. And propaganda has been with us, again, as Charlie said, since the beginnings of warfare. But when you get to World War I, all of a sudden, the scope, the scale, the volume of it by all participants just exceeds anything that had previously existed. Now, when I went into this, the first thing I said was, what's a good definition of propaganda? And when I queried Google, I got 238 answers. I picked a couple of them. This is from Professor Harold Lasswell. Professor Lasswell was a very prominent political scientist working out of the University of Chicago from the 1920s through the 70s. And he, in 1928, produced a book on the conduct of propaganda in the Great War. It's a nice academic, fairly evenly laid out definition. Has a couple of things, though, I think need to be noted. First of all, propaganda talks about opinions or actions. It's not about a nice, clean academic discussion. It's about getting people to do things and think in particular ways, and doing it by getting inside their head. Now, a little bit shorter and possibly closer to how most people think is this one from the Oxford Languages site. Because there we're talking about biased and misleading, which is where a lot of people fall when it comes to propaganda. Propaganda is not an entirely clean or right thing. Now, the reality for a lot of people, I say it's right. If the other guy says it isn't. And we got perfect examples of that going on, as Charlie mentioned, relative to the events in the Ukraine. Now, propaganda has been around for a long time, but the first maybe propaganda war, meaning where some of the same techniques we now see were in use, Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had a serious public relations issue problem because he had simply seized power. He invented the title of Emperor of the French, and he had to keep the picture forward at all times of this heroic, all-conquering figure, to the point that he even secretly subsidized some newspapers in London, not to be pro-French, but to be in position to support the political opposition to get in the way of the British government contacting the war against him. The Brits, of course, had a different viewpoint. The caption there is a little hard to read. It says, "Me shall make that Jean Bull tremble. Now I have found out the grand conveyance." My ass in a bandbox. One of the great techniques of propaganda is make fun of your enemy. Now, in the 20th century, of course, again from Professor Laswell, this makes the point that the first target of propaganda in World War I was not the enemy. It was your own people. This was really the first war where every single aspect of national life and national power had to be harnessed to the conduct of the war. And uniformity of opinion was essential. They didn't always manage it, but they aimed for it. What changed? Let's talk about scope to begin with. Napoleon had a few newspapers in London to deal with. By the time we get to World War I, well, just as the war touched every continent except Antarctica, so did propaganda. The United States ended up with propaganda efforts throughout the Western Hemisphere, all of Europe, Russia, China, Japan. Now, we didn't get into Africa. It all belonged to the colonial powers. And we didn't get much into India, but just about every place else. Scale, well, instead of a few newspapers, we're now talking about literally millions of copies of books, pamphlets, posters, cards, letters, anything you can think of, spread about over the entire world's surface. New technologies, and this is both technologies in producing the propaganda and disseminating it. Photography in particular enables propagandists to send their message in very strong form in a way that was never popular before. Radio and things like the undersea cable, as well as technologies like aviation, mean that propaganda material that would have taken weeks, maybe even months, to get from one place to another can now be across the world in a day. New targets. I sincerely doubt if anybody in the Napoleonic Wars would have bothered to address much in the way of propaganda, for example, to the ordinary soldier. A good proportion of them were illiterate anyway, and they weren't allowed to think much for themselves, so why bother? By now, the enemy soldier is a major target, along with the entire enemy population. And finally, new objectives. Again, in the Napoleonic Wars, your objectives were to influence the decision makers, the people that really made a difference in these various countries. Now you have objectives like, let's see if we can break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire by encouraging their ethnic groups to rebel, something that probably wouldn't have been thought of earlier. Now, propaganda can be described in three different shades. First, you have white propaganda. The source of the information is clearly identified. You know who's saying it. Pretty much all of the posters we have in the museum fit under the category of white propaganda. Gray propaganda, don't know who it's coming from. This is sort of like, for example, the news report you see that starts out with, "A study says." You get to the end of the report and you realize that you have no idea who did the study, where it was from, how valid it is. But it can still have some influence. A lot of great propaganda in World War I. And finally, the favorite, black propaganda. The source is false. One of the best examples of that is the famous German corpse factory idea, where supposedly there was a photograph of the bodies of German soldiers being carried off to be rendered down for glycerin and for fat to be used as soap. Now, it took a long time to figure out where that came from. The claim was made by John Charteris, who was Douglas Haig's chief of information, or intelligence rather. His claim was that he had a couple of captured German photographs, one showing German bodies being taken off for burial, and the other German dead horses being taken off to be rendered. And he just shifted the captions. True or not, still a good story. Remembering always that any of these can show up in a single item. And, just because you know where it came from doesn't mean it's trustworthy. And that's always a good question. 3 types of information: accurate and complete. Will this show up in propaganda? And the answer is yes. Best example is Woodrow Wilson's speeches. They were reprinted verbatim and distributed throughout the world. German versions of them sometimes had pieces changed out or simply omitted. So what the US would do was to reprint them and highlight the pieces where the Germans had changed them and then drop them back into Germany. Accurate but incomplete. Well, guidance that was given to the German newspapers close to the start of the war from the general staff basically was, if there's a German attack that makes its objectives but suffers 50% casualties, you can talk about taking the objective, but you can't mention the casualties. You keep out what's inconvenient. And finally, completely inaccurate, mistaken, or fake. You can think of dozens of different examples of that. Again, the corpse factory is a good one. Now, you do take a risk with mistaken or fake information, because if you put it out and your audience is able to check on you, then you may damage your own credibility. But it's oftentimes considered to be worth the risk. And again, accurate doesn't mean it's something that's objective, unbiased, or balanced. And again, you can get it all in one single thing. Let's stay with the 3 audiences. Now, the most important one to start with is at home. You're trying to convince your people that this war is worth fighting and they need to come together to ensure victory over the enemy. You're also going to do your level best to make the enemy look into the worst possible light, either stupid or simply vicious. For the enemy, let's be discouraging. And sowing dissension amongst the enemy is not new, but the scope of it in World War I was rather considerable. And finally, for the neutrals, you would prefer to have the neutrals join you. But if they're not going to do that, they should at least stay really neutral and don't help the enemy at all. And as you'll see later, once we get going into the war, it's actually the neutrals that are the number 2 target for most of the participants in terms of propaganda, with the enemy taking up the 3rd position for the amount of effort. And again, all 3 in one place. All right, propaganda methods. You'll see different lists of this, but I think this one is a fairly decent one. Start with is name calling. The classic comes right off of the middle school playground. This particular poster was actually developed by the U.S. Army, not by the Committee on Public Information. And it shows that name calling can be both verbal, mad brute, and visual. That rather ugly looking monkey character with the helpless maiden and the Kultur club in his hands. This is one of the more lurid ones on the U.S. side. Testimonial. This is where you get one of the known and respected people from your country to support the message that you're putting out. In this case, it's Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War. And as you can see, where James Montgomery Flagg got the idea for Uncle Sam. Fear. Classic again. This is a German one. What England wants. This one plays to the theme that the Germans always put forward, that Britain was in the war really because they were jealous of German economic progress and industrial power. So what you have is the image of clouds of British airplanes flying over German industry and bombing them. This can be used in many different ways, and you'll see it in some of the other posters. Finally, loaded words. Words count. Words are exceptionally powerful, and they're really the ammunition of propaganda. This poster, you've got them loaded in both ways, civilization and barbarism. And it's a lesson that the British in particular paid close attention to. The Germans never seemed to learn it right. And I'll talk about that when we get to each of their country conduct of propaganda. Bandwagon. We're all in this together. Let's get everybody going in one direction. This one is interesting, British, because Britain at this point is still a very class-driven society. And this poster has got everybody from the gentleman in the top hat to the laborer with a pickaxe on his shoulder, all of them marching together, which is something that probably nobody would ever have thought of much before this point. And then glittering generalities. Wonderful words that when you take a good close look at them, you have a very hard time pinning down what do they actually mean and how do we put them into practice. An example of this also would be out of the 14 points, the various things that Wilson has to say about what comes out being called national or self-determination. How do you do that? What does that mean? Plain folks, it's a little bit like bandwagon, except the idea here is we want to make sure, again, that everybody understands it's not just the upper part of society that's in this thing. We got to all work together to make it happen. In a modern political campaign, it'd be like a presidential candidate stopping by to have lunch at a burger joint in some small town. Transfer is a little like testimonial, but instead of a live person, what you're using is some well-known and respected symbol that means something to society. Uncle Sam here could be an American eagle, could be the flag, Statue of Liberty. If you were a Brit, it could be John Bull or one of their other symbols. Again, the idea is to attract people to the idea. Now, card stacking, this one basically works two ways. The first one is to put forth only one side of an argument. In this case, we've got a sailor who's being told that being in the Navy and going to sea is a wonderful opportunity. What they don't tell him is that you're going to have to be on a ship, perhaps in the stormy North Atlantic in the middle of winter, and maybe there's going to be somebody out there shooting a torpedo at you. The other way this works is to advance both sides of the argument, making sure that you emphasize the weak parts of your opponent's argument and the strong parts of your own. A lot of card stacking shows up in longer form propaganda where you've got a chance to make an argument. And finally, emotional appeal. I defy you to find something that's going to be much stronger emotionally than the sight of a drowned mother and baby. And this one hits you right square in the gut. And that's what propagandists are after. They want your attention. They want you to think what they want you to think. Now, we're going to look at three propaganda organizations. First, the British. I call it an evolving organization because it changes not radically, but significantly over the course of the war and gets more and more centralized as time goes on. Second is the German. Now, believe it or not, given the reputation of Germany for centralization and rigid discipline, the German propaganda organization is the least centralized and least coordinated of any of the three. Kind of surprised me as I dug into it, but the fact was that they were never really able to come up with any kind of a single guidance form for their propaganda effort. And it weakened their efforts overall. Finally, the U.S. propaganda organization was centralized to the point of being autocratic. There were really only two people involved in its direction, and I'll talk about the two of them as we get further into it. But it's not quite what you would have expected out of the United States, at least at the start of the war. And it's a perfect example of the fact we were thrown into something with very little preparation ahead of time, and the organization that resulted was the result of necessity. Okay, British organization. It says pre-1917 because in December of 1916, there was a major change in the British government. The Asquith government fell, and Herbert Asquith, whose leadership style was loose at best, was replaced by David Lloyd George, who was a considerably more vigorous leader and who threw changes at everything to include the propaganda. Now, to start with, the British had the press bureau of the Foreign Office. Throughout the war, it remained the place where any information about foreign policy originated. And it got bigger and bigger as time went on. Shortly after the war started, the government established something called the War Propaganda Board. It's also more commonly called Wellington House, from the name of the office building where they worked. Their job was printed propaganda, books and pamphlets. In the course of the war, they produced over 1,100. And one of the more interesting things about it is that its existence was kept secret, even from most of Parliament. It was never acknowledged publicly, and they made a point of not having their materials show up as if they were official British publications. The attitude the British took was that official propaganda is much more likely to be ignored. So what they wanted to have this stuff look like it was just coming from somebody somewhere in England as it spread throughout the world. There were a lot of private propagandists. One of the biggest examples is the faculty of Oxford University. During the course of the war, they produced something over 60 rather learned and sometimes extensive pamphlets and publications supporting the war. Now, one of the problems with the private propagandists, and there were a couple of public associations that did the same sort of thing, is they don't always check with the official propagandists to make sure that the arguments they make are in line with what the official side is saying. Caused a few embarrassments, wasn't serious, but it was something that had to be watched. Now, propaganda within the UK was the responsibility of the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee, because at the start of the war, the big challenge was to get people to join up for the military. So they had recruiting fairs all over the country. They're the ones who did the early recruiting posters and generally were responsible for all of the domestic propaganda. Foreign Office was doing the stuff that went out officially. The War Propaganda Board was doing the publications, but Parliament was doing the recruiting. Now, the Home Office, and I'm not sure why they had it, but it was given to them, had something called the Neutral Press Committee. This was the organization that neutral press organizations could come to get official news from the United Kingdom government. They were not basically allowed to go into France and to go anywhere near the front lines. If you wanted the news, you came to the Home Office. Home Office also had something called the Press Bureau, which was known to the British newspapers as the Suppress Bureau, because these are the people responsible for, number one, putting out the official press releases, which were the only thing you were supposed to publish about the war. And number two, they enforced censorship on the British press, not to the very great liking of the British press. Finally, the War Office and the Admiralty both did their forms of propaganda, the War Office more than the Admiralty. And the War Office had a number of organizations that changed names over time, finally settling down on MI7, Section 7 of military intelligence. Their job was propaganda against Germans on the front line, combat propaganda, if you like. And as you'll notice, there's nobody here that's really doing heavy-duty propaganda work into Germany. There were things getting in there, particularly from the Foreign Office, through Switzerland, through the Netherlands, through Denmark. But the British at this point are more concentrating on getting things done at home, and as you'll see later, on influencing the United States than they are anything else. They also had the Films and Wireless Committee, which turned out to be quite successful. They produced a number of feature-type films about the war, and by wireless, it means they were sending out radio news releases by wireless. Now, this is one of the points I wanted to make about the use of words. The first propagandists, these are the people that were going to be working out of Wellington House under the direction of one Charles Masterman. Masterman is a second-level British politician who also happens to be a director of the insurance company that occupied Wellington House. So his presence there and the presence of other people provided good cover. Nobody had to be suspicious of what they were doing. On the 2nd of September, 1914, Masterman calls a meeting of a fairly large number of writers around the UK. These are people that he wants to be writing for his propaganda materials. Now there's a group of 6. H.G. Wells, John Masefield, who becomes Poet Laureate of the UK, Thomas Hardy, Arthur Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton, John Galsworthy. Rudyard Kipling was invited and couldn't make it that day. The important thing about these men and the others that came is that they are among the most successful and best known writers in the English language at the time. These are people who know how to use language, know how to use words for their emotional impact. And they all sit down and write things over the course of the war in support of the propaganda effort. Some of them become rather disaffected as time goes on. Both Wells and Conan Doyle lost sons in the war. But at the start of it, Conan Doyle, for example, writes a Sherlock Holmes short story called His Last Bow about an elderly Holmes coming out of retirement to engage German spies. There's a considerable difference between these people and the people who write German propaganda, which I'll talk about later. There's one other person that you need to know. That is Sir Gilbert Parker. Now, Parker is also an author. He happens to be Canadian. He's well known in the US, a little bit lesser than the 6 down below, but still well enough known that people understand what the name is. His job is to run the part of Wellington House that is oriented on the United States. So for a long time, Americans might suddenly find in their mail a pamphlet talking about how evil the Germans are, or talking about why Britain is really in the war, so forth and so on, with a little card that says, with the compliments of Sir Gilbert Parker. Nothing in there says that it came from an official British government operation. There were also a couple of other things that they did. They started out and simply grabbed a copy of Who's Who in America and started mailing material to people from there. and followed up with a lot of other contacts of the same sort. They were doing their level best to get the idea across without it being obvious that this was British official stuff. Now, starting in early 1917, as Lloyd George takes over, the British organization begins to change. First of all, the National War Aims Committee takes over from the old Parliamentary Recruiting Committee. Conscription is now in force. You don't have to get people to enlist. You can make them enlist. And the War Aims Committee becomes the domestic propaganda arm. In January of 1917, the Department of Information is formed. It's supposed to coordinate all of those other organizations. Doesn't really do all that good a job of it, mostly because each one of them has their own budget, and several of them have the right of access either to the prime minister or to other senior ministers, which means they're hard to control. So Lloyd George brings in two new faces, Beaverbrook and Northcliffe. These are the two biggest newspaper lords in Britain. Beaverbrook is Canadian, but he owns and runs the Daily Express and a bunch of other papers. Northcliffe runs the Daily Mail, which at the time was the largest circulation English language newspaper in the world. And they have completely different ideas about what you should be doing with propaganda. Up to now, the idea has been influence the influencers. Now they're saying we're going for mass audience. February 1918, Ministry of Information is formed with Beaverbrook as the minister. At the same time, another organization called the Director of Propaganda in Enemy Countries, also known as Crew House from its building, under Northcliffe, gets going. Supposedly, Northcliffe answers to Beaverbrook. They don't like each other, so that doesn't work very much, but that's fine because they have different objectives. By the way, MI7 from the War Office continues to do its work on the front lines. And from this point on, news releases, all sorts of attempts to get material into Germany simply skyrocket. The amount of stuff goes up by a factor of about 5. And they're working through every channel they can think of. They're sending stuff in through Switzerland. They're getting material into Swiss and Swedish and Danish and Dutch newspapers in the knowledge that those newspapers go across the border into Germany. And German newspapers can and sometimes often will pick up news reports that meet their particular needs. Northcliffe, in particular, ends up being the boogeyman to the Germans, precisely because of the success he has. Okay, methods. First of all, from the get-go, we're the major external target of their efforts. The fact that we share mostly a common language is there, but the British are really aware that we are the #1 industrial power in the world. And it doesn't take long for them to figure out that they're going to have to get money from us and materials from us at some point. They did not establish any kind of an official open propaganda office. They operated out of the embassy. And as I said, they do their level best to make it not appear that what was coming in was official. And then the use of personal contacts started out with the who's who mailing. By the time the war is over, they've got 160,000 American addresses that they are mailing things to, tailored to the individual in very large extent. And British ships, of course, are coming across the Atlantic easily. So they can import all of the printed material that they want to. There's another use of personal contacts. Throughout the war, Brits with an international reputation scholars, authors, actors, and those with pretty senior titles, the Duke of this, the Earl of that, the Baron of the other thing, come across, oh, we're just going to make a visit to the United States. Some of them go around and make speeches. They're pretty obvious that they're trying to get their view across. Others, well, suppose the Duke of Devonshire is just paying a visit to Boston. Every society hostess in Boston, and this was the end of the era of the great hostesses, wants to have him at one of her parties. So he goes around from party to party, and he very congenially has conversations with various people. Well, you know, we're having this issue with the Germans over their cruelty to the Belgians, and so forth and so on. And they'll exchange calling cards, and then he goes on to the next one. And the idea is to create this network of people who have been at least touched, if not openly recruited by these British visitors. Works a charm for them. Secondly, they do have strict military censorship with a lot of pushback from the newspapers. In 1914, they allow exactly 2 reporters to go to France with the BEF. There's a third reporter who makes his way over there on his own. He ends up being policed up, taken back to Britain, and Lord Kitchener basically says, if you go back, I'll have you shot. By 1915, there's a party of 5 more. Each one of them has a personal escort, an older, more senior officer who is not able to go into the line, but who probably despises reporters. And they make absolutely sure that nothing gets out they don't want to. This, by the way, is one of the things where when we get into the war later, it causes a great deal of consternation because we send bunches of reporters. They make tremendous emphasis on German war guilt and brutality. The newspapers also love to grab the more lurid atrocity stories. And these things really get, in some cases, almost ridiculously extreme. And it has unintended consequences that I'll talk about at the end of this discussion that cost them later on. They do make an attempt to control German news. Now, the first thing, and I will mention this again, that the first offensive action of the United Kingdom in the war is to send a ship out to cut all 5 of the German undersea cables. This means that Germany is stuck either with trying to get their news out through the neutrals, or they have one very powerful radio station that they can send it out, but that's limited volume. They do get things out on cables from the Netherlands and from Sweden in particular, but those cables all go through Britain. So the Brits are in a position they can at times either, shall we say, edit German news reports or simply delete them. They are late into propaganda in Germany. When they go, they jump in with both feet. But it's something that you kind of wonder why. And I think the best explanation is that early on, they thought it wasn't worth the effort. They really didn't believe that British propaganda could have much influence inside Germany. So why put the effort into it? Some of the things they put out, these, of course, all went up around Britain. I love the Knights of the Air one. The Kaiser praising his aviators who were busy bombing hospitals. The home front stuff, well, this is along with some of the things like Bandwagon, Women of Britain Say Go, which are also for the first time recruiting women to do things that only men did before. Now, one of the almost ridiculously successful publications that was put out, this one they did choose to say it came from the British government. It's called the Bryce Report. The man who headed the committee was Lord Bryce, and he was very carefully picked because he was the previous British ambassador to the United States. Well known, well liked, respected, and trusted. And what they did was to send British lawyers throughout the island to find and interview Belgian refugees looking for war atrocity stories. They didn't really try and find out whether they were true. They simply copied them down and ended up with about 1,200 of them. In the pamphlet, most of them are listed as a short paragraph. And they ranged from fairly accurate descriptions of some of the mass hostage executions. Remember, we had a presentation about this several months ago. On to the more lurid ones, bayoneting babies, cutting children's hands off, et cetera, et cetera. They translated this thing into 30 languages and sent it around the world. And it had a huge impact in the United States. Came out in early 1915. It tended to put the Germans on a back foot. All of a sudden, you had all these stories coming out about how horrible they were behaving. And some of them were even true. A lot of them weren't, but some of them were even true. And it put them at a disadvantage later on. Now, I put this in because I find the idea of leaflets interesting, and it's one of the places where I can do a direct comparison between the three. The first time I can find evidence of aerial leaflet drops is in the Franco-Prussian War. The Communist government in Paris, surrounded by Germans, would put leaflets up in hot air balloons to be dropped over German lines. We get to World War I, and MI7 on the British side, the French were doing it, the Germans were doing it, was printing quite literally tens of thousands of leaflets and sending flyers up to drop them over enemy lines. Pilots tended not to like to do this. First of all, because you're dropping paper, not bombs. And unless you forget to untie the package, you're probably not going to kill anybody on the ground with paper. And secondly, because you're risking your life to go drop paper. Are they effective? Well, the German ones tended not to be, for reasons I'll talk about later. The British leaflets in particular do seem to have had an effect, because by early 1917, the Germans suddenly announced that dropping what they called seditious literature from the air was, in their opinion, a violation of international law. So in January of 1917, they put a couple of British pilots on trial and sentenced them to 10 years imprisonment. The result is the British start dropping them from balloons. Now, these are made of paper and they've been lacquered to be gas tight. You fill them with hydrogen or sometimes with lighter than air cooking gas, and you suspend a bundle of leaflets down below. You have a piece of slow burning fuse that goes slowly up to time when they're released, and a piece of quick fuse around the bundle of leaflets itself. You wait till the wind is in the right direction, which is reasonably important. You let them go. They drift over enemy lines, and at some point, slow burning fuse reaches the fast fuse. The fast fuse flashes, opens up the package, and drops the leaflets over enemy lines. And then if you're feeling very, you want to show magic tricks, you just let the fuse go on up to the balloon, which then is consumed in flame and simply vanishes. This is done on all fronts. Germans don't seem to have done it as much as the British did. And when we get into the war, we adapt this methodology. Now, British leaflets, well, there's one. The inscription on the Iron Cross says, "The German soldier, the price of victory." and the German is being nailed to the Iron Cross by a character whose build identifies him as the General, der General. This is one of those where it comes down, you look at it, and it has its immediate emotional effect. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to read it or anything else. All you have to do is see it. And it's very, very effective as a result. One other thing the British did was Le Courrier de l'Air. It was distributed by balloon, and the target of this was not so much the Germans as it was the population of the occupied parts of France down into Alsace-Lorraine. Of course, these things would get into the hands of German soldiers. And what they did was, it's a news sheet about things going on in the war, the Allied view of things going on in the war. Propaganda, counter-propaganda, you might call it. And this one I had just to throw in there. This is not British, German, or American. It's Italian. Gabriele Annunzio was a hyper-patriot Italian. He's a poet. He's actually on the Pantheon de la Guerre. He's the guy in the black coat on the steps making the dramatic gesture towards the Italian king. In the war, he's a pilot. And in August of 1918, he organizes a flight of Italian aircraft to take off, fly over the Alps, and drop leaflets on Vienna. Now, basically what the leaflet says is, Viennese, aren't you glad these are leaflets and not bombs? We don't make war on lists, the various kinds of non-combatants. Your people do. Just remember, we've warned you. Long live freedom, long live Italy, long live the Entente. Nobody has anything that I've been able to find that says what the Viennese thought about the whole thing, but by August of 1918, they probably weren't real happy about being in the war anyway. Now, one thing the British were extremely expert at was opportunism. They saw opportunities and they took them for their propaganda effect. Number one, the scrap of paper. Now, this supposedly arises when the British ambassador delivers their ultimatum about get out of Belgium to the German chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg. And Hollweg says, would you go to war over a scrap of paper, meaning the Belgian neutrality treaty, which Germany had signed? They grab it immediately. Germany thinks that treaties are simply scraps of paper. They can't be trusted. Enlist today to help us keep these people out. Secondly, the sinking of the Lusitania. Big deal in the United States for American lives lost. But the mistake the Germans made and that the British took advantage of was they tended to portray this as being a German victory, and the lives lost on the Lusitania, well, it was their own fault because they were traveling on a British ship with munitions aboard. The Brits turned this around into German inhumanity and willingness to sacrifice innocent lives for their military ends. They never quite get the idea. Edith Clavell, British nurse working in Belgium. Germans come through because she continues to work. They leave her alone. But she starts helping British and French soldiers who have been left behind make their way out of Belgium and into neutral Netherlands. And a lot of them eventually are able to get back to Britain. The Germans catch her at it. They court-martial her and sentence her to death. She's shot by firing squad. Now, in terms of actual legal procedure of the day and the laws of the day, the Germans had every right to do that. She was doing something she should not have been doing. But shooting a woman, shooting a middle-aged nurse, the Brits jumped on it so hard as a perfect example of German inhumanity. There were also rumors started of things like Edith Clavell fainted on the way to being shot, and a German officer simply shot her in the head as she was laying in the mud. That wasn't true, but it appeared in British newspapers that way. And again, the Germans never seemed to have understood the impact of it, and they really didn't seem to understand why everybody was so upset. Shortly after Clavell was shot, the French shot a German woman who had been working in France as a spy. And when an American reporter asked an official in the German War Ministry why they didn't object, his comment was, "Why should we? They had every right." So the emphasis was on law, not on the emotional impact. Finally, sometimes your friends are not your friends. There was a German artist named Karl Getz, and he made what was called back then medals. These days, they're about the size and so forth of the challenge coins that you'll see all over the place. And sometime after the Lusitania was sunk, he decided he was going to do what he thought was a satirical medal on the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, on the one side, we have people lining up to buy tickets on the Lusitania. Death is who is selling the tickets. And up at the top, we have a banner that says "Business above all." On the other side, we have a picture of the Lusitania sinking. There's a banner up there that says "No contraband." Supposedly, and it's hard to see, on the deck of the Lusitania are artillery pieces and aircraft. And the caption at the bottom says the British steamer Lusitania sunk by a German submarine on the 5th of May, 1915. Two problems. One, they show the Lusitania sinking by the stern, not the bow. And oh, by the way, she has the bow configuration of a pre-war warship, a ram bow. And secondly, the Lusitania was sunk on the 7th of May, not the 5th. The British get a hold of these things and Getz made something under 500 of the original out of a bronze alloy. He later said he got the date wrong because of a newspaper mistake, and he put out a few more with a corrected date on it. But what the British did was to take this thing, trumpet it as being evidence that the Germans had plotted all along to sink the Lusitania and kill all those innocent people. Because after all, how could they get the date wrong unless they'd been planning to sink it on the 7th? And number two, they were probably planning to torpedo it in the stern, not the bow. The British took it and made 250,000 copies in cast iron. You can still find them for sale on eBay for more than I care to pay right now, and sold them for a shilling each. And they also sent a bunch to the US to make the point of just how inhumane the Germans were. Of course, the number one opportunity, and it's a good question whether this was propaganda or political warfare, was the Zimmermann telegram. Now, the British had to go through a number of hoops to get this into our hands without us figuring out, not the Germans figuring out, that they had broken their code, and without us figuring out that they were tapping the American diplomatic cable between Stockholm and Washington, because Wilson had given the Germans permission to use that cable as long as the messages they were sending were restricted to peace negotiation issues, which just made Wilson all the more angry when he discovered that that message had appeared. You'll notice that this is a Western Union telegram. It's the same one that's on the wall outside of Horizon Theater. And the British waited until they were able to produce the false story that they had managed to steal the telegram from the Germans in Mexico. And not that they'd taken it directly off the cable from Sweden. That way, they could keep their secrets. Now, the Germans had been active in Mexico for a long time, stirring up trouble. So when this appears, it's just the straw that broke the camel's back. Now let's switch to look at the Germans. The Germans do not have, and never completely put together, a Ministry of Propaganda or Information. What they have is an information committee. All of these people are on it. The one that exists to start with, of course, is the Press Bureau of the Foreign Ministry, and they're the ones who put out a very large proportion of the news releases that go to the U.S. The Interior, Colonial, and Food Ministries are concerned with propaganda inside Germany, but occasionally you run into problems. One example is that at one point, one of the German-American organizations in the U.S. is putting forth the idea that German children are suffering from a lack of milk because of the British blockade. An American reporter in Germany, we're still neutral at this point, goes to the food ministry and asks about it. The food ministry's job was to make everything sound hunky-dory. So their response was, why no? There's no problems with milk. We have plenty. War and Naval Ministries, they had had a limited amount of contact with the press, primarily because they both had to deal with the Reichstag, the German legislature. Although both of them kind of felt it was not really right, just because it was too political. The General Staff, Army Headquarters, why are they not with the War Ministry? Because they answered to the Kaiser, not to the War Ministry. They had had a long-standing low-level agreement with an outfit called Wolf's Telegraphic Bureau, which was the German equivalent of, say, Reuters or the Associated Press. And once we get into the war, they start using Wolf's to send stuff out. Initially, it's not as much as it grows into. Falkenhayn is not wildly concerned about propaganda. His attention is elsewhere. That changes rather significantly when Ludendorff and Hindenburg, particularly Ludendorff, come in August of 1916. Hindenburg doesn't care much about propaganda. Ludendorff loves it. And something called the War Press Bureau has already existed on the basis of Wolf's Telegraphic Bureau, and it just gets bigger and bigger. This is about the time, too, when the General Staff begins to press hard, trying to get even more control over propaganda than they'd previously had. They'd always tried to be the first among equals. Some of the others, particularly the Foreign Ministry, didn't really want to cooperate. And it's that dichotomy between the civil and military side that prevents the Germans from ever really coordinating their efforts. Now, in early 17, the General Staff puts together something called the Photo and Film Office. BUFA is its acronym in German, Bild- und Filmamt. That's the first time they had an organized effort to use photographs, although they'd done it continuously through. But one of the primary things they were trying to do was to use films back home to try and raise civil morale. Didn't work really well. By the end of the year, they were trying again with a different organization, Universum Film Akte und Gesellschaft. That does a little better, but by that point, morale is so low at home that it's, you're trying to raise a lead balloon at that point. Although Universum Film continues to exist after the war and becomes one of the foundations of the post-war German motion picture industry. Treasury's involved and the press is involved. The press doesn't like this. particularly the left-wing press, the socialist press, and for various other reasons, the Catholic press, which is quite strong, doesn't care for a lot of the limitations, but they have no choice. This thing has a rotating presidency, doesn't help much for coordination, meets weekly, doesn't do much. They do get limitations. They're told by the general staff military things that they can and can't say, but it's not what you would call a truly coordinated effort. Censorship in Germany of military information was strict, however, because it wasn't under this committee. Germany had been divided into corps areas. Each one of them had a corps commanding general and a deputy commander. And upon mobilization, the commanding general formed an infantry corps, an army corps out of his area, and they marched off to war. The deputy commander stayed behind and became close to a dictator for that district. His authority came from the Kaiser, and he could ignore, and often did, any civil leadership. And each of these deputy commanders then set up a press censorship office. Now, in some of the more rural areas, this may have been 3 or 4 officers who did it part-time. Someplace like Berlin, it's several hundred full-time censors who are looking at the newspapers. Papers are told to submit their product ahead of time to be looked at, and they're very, very careful that military information per se doesn't get out. What's weird, however, is that they didn't seem to limit the entry of foreign newspapers and, in some cases, even foreign news organizations into Germany. What was then happening was that German newspapers would find an item in a, say, a Swiss paper or a Danish paper that they liked, and they would publish it. And it didn't seem to be censored. So there were holes in what was allowed through. Later on, that gets identified by some later Germans as one of the weaknesses. Now, the real problem, of course, is the military and civilian side can't get along. And you get the smiling pair on the left and the unfortunate gentleman, that's Bethmann Hollweg, on the right. The military commanders attempt to dictate to the civilian government, who doesn't take kindly to that. The civilian government does things like Bethmann Hollweg would respond positively at times to some of Woodrow Wilson's proposals, and that just pissed off Ludendorff, who would insist that the only thing that should go out in German news and in German propaganda was the inevitability of German victory. Eventually, of course, Bethmann Hollweg goes away, and from that point on, the civilian government becomes pretty much under Ludendorff's thumb. Now, one of the first things Germany puts out, surprisingly early in the war, is the German White Book on the outbreak of the German-Russian-French War. You'll notice the Brits aren't even mentioned in this as yet, and it's very early. That's a library stamp up in the upper right-hand corner, the 28th of August, 1914. So this is already going into a library 24 days after the British have declared war. What it is a collection of diplomatic documents and communications that are intended to demonstrate that the war wasn't Germany's fault. They were forced into it. Of course, as soon as that comes out, everybody else pulls out their coloring books and begins to publish the same kind of thing. And they go on, these things continue to appear at different points during the war. Now, there's 2 things that are interesting about them. First of all, from a historical standpoint, they're important because they reflect what the various countries wanted everybody to believe. Secondly, they're important because none of them are, in fact, honest. I saw one analysis of the German White Book that said about 70% of the documents in it had been altered in some way or another. Of course, the average person reading one of these things is not going to know that. And frankly, the average person is probably going to open it, look at the front page, and says, no, not interested. So if they were going to go anyplace, they were going to go to, hopefully, people who had some influence over opinion. Now, the Germans had a few extra challenges. First of all, as I've already mentioned, first day of the war, the British send a cable ship out. That's Telconia. Actually belongs to the British Post Office, to fish up and cut the German cables. For a little while, they can get that stuff out through Italy, because Italy at this point, until the middle of 1915, is still neutral. Brits can't cut those cables for an obvious reason. They can then try to get things out through the Dutch and the Swedes. Both of those cables come ashore in the UK and are interceptable and are liberally intercepted. They can then try and get stuff out through their radio station at Nauen. Nauen is up northwest of Berlin, about 50 miles. It at the time was the most powerful radio station on Earth. It had a capability of being heard 3,000 miles away in the daytime, much further at night. Those of us who will remember the days of, I forget the station's name, out of Del Rio, Texas, that were always playing country music. You couldn't hear it over most of the US in the daytime, but as soon as the sun went down and the sun quit messing with the ionosphere, you could hear it all over the country. Same thing with Nauen. Now, the Germans had two radio stations in the United States built by Telefunken, one in New Jersey and one on Long Island, that both of whom could communicate with Nauen. Early on, very early in the war, they could do this freely, but very soon after the war started, Wilson decided neutrality required that we limit the use of those stations. The US Navy moves in, and basically you can't send stuff out of the United States that's encrypted unless you give the United States government the code. You can still receive some stuff that's encrypted because it doesn't matter if it's coming in, because how can you violate neutrality if it's coming into the United States, which is primarily an indication of naivete on the part of the US. But the other limitation of Nauen is that it's manual Morse. So the amount of stuff you can send out and get around is difficult. Blockade running takes two forms. One of them is putting people with false documents aboard neutral ships and having them head to wherever they're going, primarily to the US. You got to hope they get through. Some do. You also very occasionally manage to get a ship out past the British blockade. That's not too often. They do try it a couple of times with a submarine, but they don't use the submarine for any propaganda material. Its cargo carrying is too valuable. You can send out stuff by mail through the neutrals, and they do. The Dutch, the Swedes, the Danish. The problem there is the British are not entirely unwilling to stop and search neutral ships, and if they think something has been sent from Germany, they'll simply open it and check or simply confiscate it. So you get a degree of difficulty in getting stuff out. And finally, smuggling, which turns out to be, for a couple of stewards on Norwegian liners, a very, very profitable side hustle. They do get stuff out. It's enough to feed the system in the US, but it's nothing like the volume that the Brits can get out. Now, this is one that I put in deliberately because of something you'll see next. Germany complains bitterly about the French and the British using non-white colonial troops in Europe. You're not supposed to use the lesser races against white men. this kind of ridiculous, overblown cartoon just is part of the example. And by the way, down here in the corner, there's a couple of other black-faced troops, both of whom appear to be wearing kilts, which I do not understand because there were no African Scottish regiments out there at all. Germany was quite a racist society at the time. The Kaiser even claimed to have invented the phrase "the yellow peril," and talking about the dangers of Orientals. So, in the light of that, here's a couple of German leaflets dropped over American lines. The one on the left is addressed, as you see, to the colored soldiers of the U.S. Army. Now, the first paragraph makes a lot of good points about how unequal American society is at the time. Raises the questions of things like lynching, the Jim Crow laws, so forth and so on. The next paragraph then claims, to read the first line, all that is entirely different in Germany, where they do like colored people when they treat them as gentlemen and not as second-class citizens. I'm sorry. That's about as unreal as you can get. The bottom one is just an encouragement for, why fight the Germans for the benefit of Jim Crow? Come over to us. I don't know how effective the thing actually was. I suspect not very. The other one is intended for soldiers in general, and it makes the rather convoluted argument that you're in Germany, you're in France fighting Germans who have never done anything to you. Therefore, it's the better part of valor is to surrender, not to continue fighting. And frankly, you read it a couple of times and the average soldier is going to be scratching his head saying, what? The other point about this is that both of them are all words. And as best I can tell, a very large proportion of the German leaflets were all words. Not many of them seem to have survived in a form where I could get a hold of an image of them. They may be available in historical collections at, say, Carlisle Barracks or someplace like that, but I couldn't get at them. But it just demonstrates, number one, wordiness of this nature does not have the impact that the soldier being nailed to the cross has. And it's somewhat typical of German procedures during the war. Now, in the US, and we're focusing there now, who were the propagandists? Well, the man in theoretical control was Ambassador Johann von Bernstorff. He had been put in charge of all German open and clandestine activities in the US because they didn't have anybody else over here. Believe it or not, Germany had one sleeper agent, intelligence agent in the US before the war started. Now, when Bernstorff had just visited Germany and been given his marching orders, when he came back, he was accompanied by Dr. Heinrich Albert as a representative of the German Interior Ministry, commercial attaché, whose job supposedly was to buy things for Germany. He turns out to be the paymaster for all German legal and illegal activities in the United States. Very clever man, very effective at his job, with one major exception. In July of 1915, Dr. Albert has just been meeting with a German gentleman running a pro-German publication in New York, which he was being supported by the German embassy. They leave, and Heinrich Albert gets on an elevated train to go back to his office. What he doesn't know is by that point, the U.S. Secret Service is tailing him because the Secret Service, working for the Treasury Department, has basically been told, find out where he's getting all this money and what he's doing with it. Dr. Albert falls asleep. It's a hot day. It's July in New York. All of a sudden, they get to his stop. He jerks awake and gets off the train, leaving his briefcase behind. The Secret Service agent who's been following grabs it and makes off with it. Takes it to his boss, the director of the Secret Service. They take it to the Secretary of the Treasury, McAdoo, who also happens to be Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law. And while they don't find anything in the papers in it that's strictly speaking illegal, they find he's been spending a lot of money to influence opinion in the United States. And they proceed to give that to the newspapers, causes all sorts of consternation. Now, Dr. Dernberg, the next guy over, also comes back with Bernstorff. He supposedly is a representative of the German Red Cross in the US to raise money. He's also there to try and just sell German bank bonds to raise money. But Wilson basically puts out the word that buying German bonds, buying British bonds at this point, or French ones, is just not a good idea. Don't do it. So Dernberg ends up running German propaganda in the United States. I'll talk about the structure he works in just a minute. But this continues until May of 1915. When the Lusitania is sunk, Dernberg makes the mistake of giving speeches that defend the German sinking and present it as being a great success for Germany. It raises such huge animosity against him that he actually has to be sent back to Germany. Leaves in June of 1915. At that point, propaganda is taken over by Dr. Fuhrer, the next guy over. Now, Fuhrer got basically trapped in the US because he'd been an interpreter at the Japanese embassy at the German embassy in Japan. And of course, when Japan gets into the war on the Allied side, he has to leave. So he comes over and he covers propaganda from the middle of 1915 on till the time of the break in diplomatic relations. You got two other characters in here who have an impact on propaganda, not necessarily a good one. Von Papen and Boyed, respectively the military and naval attaches, set up their own propaganda office in New York. All of these offices are in New York, not Washington. And they also carry on a rather vigorous campaign, not always successful, of sabotage and espionage around the United States. And as information about this begins to come out, it tends to damage the believability of the German propaganda effort in the United States. These two are finally persona non grata at the end of 1916, and they are sent home. But they have assistants that stay and try and continue what they were doing. How were they organized? Well, first of all, you had a lot of homegrown propagandists, particularly at the start of the war. And to a considerable extent, they were more effective than a lot of the official German propaganda. You had the National German American Association, biggest international membership organization in the country. A lot of pro-German press and many individuals, including some very well-known ones, all of whom pressed for German view throughout the country. Dernberg's operation was known as the German Information Service. It was an open office in New York City. They got their material whatever way they could from Germany. They did press releases, articles. Everything went out under official German labels. You recall I said that the British didn't want to look like official propaganda. The Germans did want to look like official propaganda. I think it's a cultural difference. In Germany, if an official says something, everybody accepts it. And they more or less were taking the same attitude. If the German government is saying it, you ought to believe it, which, as far as perhaps some of the German American population is concerned, might have worked. For a lot of the other population, it did not. One thing very interesting that they did is spend $1.5 million through American cutouts, so it didn't look like the embassy was doing it, to buy a newspaper in New York, the New York Evening Mail. And that then became a way of getting their press material out, because you could publish it in the New York Evening Mail and hope that other papers would then pick it up. And it didn't look quite so official. There was also the War Press Bureau, run by the attachés. This was an extension of the General Staff's War Press Bureau. It had the problem of being entirely too clumsy in many cases. And as time went on, it became less and less of a publication of propaganda and more collecting information on U.S. political and economic status. Now, interestingly, the information service was registered as being part of the embassy. The War Press Bureau was registered as being an advertising office. So somewhat later, after von Papen and Boyed had been sent home, the Secret Service raids it. They catch the people in there in the process of trying to lock the papers up. They prevent it. They confiscate all the papers. The Germans complain this is diplomatic territory. The answer is no, it's not. It's an advertising office, and you're doing stuff that is not advertising. So it's one of a number of cases where German documents reveal what Germany is actually doing in the U.S. How many people are involved? There were rumors that, quote, 32 fully trained propagandists had been sent from Germany to work in New York City. Now, number one, I wonder if there were actually 32 fully trained propagandists anywhere. But number two, the Germans officially complained more than once about the difficulty of getting people across the Atlantic. So many of them were simply scooped up by the British. In actual fact, the German Information Service doesn't seem to have employed more than about a dozen people, to include Dernberg. They did hire one American reporter by the name of Hale to assist them. He was very well paid, $15,000 a year in that era. He had a couple of Germans who couldn't get back to Germany and several German Americans who worked there. But it was never a wildly huge operation, certainly nothing of the scale that the rumors made it out to be. What were the themes? Number one, this is in the German American press, and you'll see there's a difference between this and the official propaganda. Germany is aggrieved. England's a hereditary enemy. They like to point out the fact that the Brits burned Washington 100 years before. It isn't our fight. That goes through much of the press. And fair play. Now, fair play doesn't show up much in the official propaganda. It does in the German American. You shouldn't sell stuff to the Allies if you're not going to sell it to the Germans. The answer would be, we'll sell it to the Germans, but they can't get it home because of freedom of the seas. And finally, the threat of German imperialism. British imperialism. The question always is, the Brits are every place in the world. If they win, there'll be a problem for us. The official themes, well, first of all, Russia started it. We're opposing pan-Slavism. If we don't stop them, nobody will. It's a defensive war because we're surrounded. This raises the excuse of military necessity, which is used constantly, justifies almost anything, to the point it becomes a boy that cries wolf. And military necessity becomes almost a dirty word in a lot of the world that's not involved with Germany. They try to make the case that Belgium wasn't really neutral. They've been having staff talks with the British. We know that the British and French were going to come into Belgium, so all we did was go in first. And oh, by the way, the Belgians, if they get shot, it's their own fault because they're shooting at us. Nobody likes that argument. It's about British and French jealousy and greed. You should be really neutral, which means don't sell ammunition and don't make loans to the Allies. German culture is superior. This shows up not so much explicitly as implicitly. There's always this notion that it should be obvious that Germany is the better place. One comment made in a German news report was that anybody who'd lived under the American form of government and the German form of government would never choose the American. And finally, always and forever, our victory is inevitable. And we get what I call the biggest piece of propaganda theater in the war. In October of 1916, German submarine U-53 surfaces in Narragansett Bay inside U.S. territorial waters. It was specifically loaded with extra fuel and food to make the trip, but of course the Americans don't have to know that. It goes sailing into Portsmouth, escorted by a rather surprised American submarine who happened to be operating in the same area, ties up. The captain, one Kapitän Leutnant Hans Rose, goes ashore, pays a courtesy visit on the port admiral. Some American officers are allowed to visit the submarine, and some, English-speaking German sailors go ashore. They buy some fresh food, which is one of the few things that a combatant warship can do in a neutral port. And they buy all the newspapers they can find that have shipping news in them. A few hours later, they cast loose, sail back out, go outside U.S. territorial waters a short distance, and proceed to stop and sink 6 ships carrying cargoes to Britain. Now, U.S. destroyers come racing out of Portsmouth. They can't do anything because it's international waters and he's within his rights. Rose allows them to save all of the crews and passengers on all of the ships. And after he sunk the 6 of them, submerges and merrily goes back home. It's a warning. This is the iron fist inside the velvet glove. Remember, we can come back, and they do later. Methods, it's official propaganda. And a lot of Americans treat it just exactly like that. It tends to be argumentative and legalistic. You know, the Brits use authors. The Germans use diplomats, lawyers, and officials to do their writing. And by the way, it's not always good English by the time it gets to us. It is reactive. The British can move much more nimbly than the Germans can, and as a result, German propaganda is very, very often left trying to answer charges. They make an assumption that German Americans are going to behave themselves in a single block. Doesn't happen. There's a lot of differentiation. They spend a lot of time preaching to the choir of the German Americans. And finally, they make a lot of attempt to influence labor, racial, and peace movements, providing money and so forth. And once that gets out to a very large proportion of the American population, that's really negative. Now, von Bernstorff has argued against a lot of what they do in propaganda throughout his time in America. Here's some of his opinions. They didn't understand what they were talking to. And the last one is maybe the most devastating. They just missed the target repeatedly. And by the way, here's a question that probably could be used for a master's degree thesis. Was sending Lenin back to Russia on the sealed train propaganda, or was it political warfare? I don't know. Interesting question. Now the U.S. When the war starts, when we get into the war, there is no U.S. propaganda organization. There's nothing official except Wilson's speeches and the various notes that have gone back and forth. There's a big problem that opinion is anything but unified. And what Wilson needs to have is that, a unified country behind the war. What comes out of it is something called the Committee on Public Information. And by the way, I've seen this cited as the Committee for Public Information and the Committee of Public Information. The correct name is the Committee on Public Information. Established 13th of April, 1917. That's the date on the executive order. Wilson actually signed it on the 16th of April, but he believed the 13 was a lucky number for him, so he backdated it. It consisted of the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, and the chairman was one George Creel. Now, Creel was a newspaper man from Missouri, started out in Kansas City, traveled around and did a number of different things. 1912, he's involved in Democratic Party politics. By 1916, he is running the Democratic National Committee's publicity organ. Wilson likes him. Wilson knows him very, very well, and he becomes the chairman of the committee. Now, the three cabinet secretaries have more than enough on their plates, and Creel basically is just left alone to run it as he chooses. There is one fly in the ointment, however. Creel is hated by the Republicans. First, because he's been putting out publicity against him, and secondly, because he is closely associated with the man that they consider to be one of the worst human beings on earth, Woodrow Wilson. And the Republicans in Congress just savage him repeatedly. But at the same time, we saw multiple faces for Britain and the Germans. There's only two faces that really count for U.S. propaganda. Wilson is the overall guider, and the one who does it is Creel individually. Now, Creel approaches it as an advertising effort. He does not allow the use of the word propaganda. Writes a book, cover is there after the war. It's about 400 pages long of propaganda about propaganda. It's as self-congratulatory as it's possible to imagine. And it includes a lot of information that, quite frankly, doesn't stand up to examination. But it was the only thing there was for a long time. Most of the records of the CPI got sort of ferreted away, and they really didn't see the light of day again until the late 30s. Now, this is what Creel wanted. And if you remember Carl's presentation on the treatment of the German American population in the U.S., well, he got what he was after. The 250,000 merry volunteers, vigilantes of the American Protective League, wandered around, releasing news pieces that said there were 200,000 trained German agents in the U.S. At maximum, the number of truly trained German agents in the U.S. never exceeded about 25. And they didn't stay around after the war started because the penalty is death then. And for those of you who think only the Germans in Nazi Germany burned books, that's a burning of German books in a little town called Baraboo, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1917. Now, how was it organized? Well, you had two sections, foreign and domestic, makes lots of sense. 14 divisions, 14 bureaus. I put a question mark there because the number of divisions and the number of bureaus was never relatively static. The thing built as time went on. Divisions, well, for example, you had a news division. You had a division for work with the foreign-born, meaning in the U.S. You had a pictorial division. You had a photographic division. You had a motion picture division. They were the big pieces. The bureaus were, for example, the ones who were, you'd have a bureau for Switzerland. You'd have a bureau for the Netherlands. You'd have a bureau for Denmark. You'd have a bureau for some of the South American countries. You also had all kinds of other services, programs, and projects. They had traveling shows that went around the country promoting things like war bonds. They had organizations that went and set up displays at state fairs. There were all kinds of other projects that went on. One of the divisions, by the way, was called the Educational Coordination Division. They're the ones that did all of the pamphlets. They made extensive use of prominent figures, actors, politicians, academics, whoever they could get a hold of. Some cases they were sort of roped into doing particular things. One of the most extensive use of them was to promote the sale of bonds. According to Creel, the final strength of the CPI was about 150,000, and that includes a bunch of volunteers. There's no real way to check that because a lot of them were not paid, and there's no record of how many there actually were. The final cost over the entire length of time it was active is about 6.8 million. The first 5.6 million of that came out of President Wilson's $100 million slush fund that Congress had given. Creel went back to Congress and got another 1.2 million later. However, he also says that they charged admission to many of the movies and other things that they produced, and that produced $2.5 million in profit that went back to the Treasury. So you're talking about 4.3 million total cost. Creel claimed that the Germans spent $500 million. And of course, his organization produced better results than that $500 million German organization. I really question that $500 million, but there are no records that show exactly how much, at least no records that survived World War II. Motion pictures was a big deal for them. They did feature films. This was the first one. It's obviously white propaganda because it's announced as being an American government. It comes, in my opinion, under the heading of accurate but incomplete. They showed American soldiers training. They showed huge numbers marching around and basically said, we're coming for you. What they didn't show was, for example, what we see in the Horizon Theater, the troops drilling in civilian clothes with wooden rifles because there wasn't enough enough rifles and enough uniforms to go around. Showed only one side of the argument. This is also a case of card stacking. They did a lot of special subjects. How to grow like a victory garden. This is military training. This is how the draft works. They had them on, these are German methods of making war, and so forth and so on. I mean, several dozen of those went out. They put a lot of emphasis on getting these movies into foreign theaters. Now, again, Creel complains that the Germans had gone out and either bought or put leases on many, many foreign theaters, and they were only allowing them to show German movies. But the facts are that Germany's movie production was kind of low during the war. They didn't have the resources, and so many of the people that they needed were already in the military. So I don't know how true that is. But what Creel says they did, because there was a paucity of movies to show, Hollywood was still putting out lots. So if you want to use Hollywood movies, you got to show the Committee on Public Information movies as well. The way he puts it is that the Kaiser was defeated by Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford. And finally, there were many, many, many private war films made. A lot of them before we get into the war. Some favor the German side. Those tended to vanish fairly quickly once we really got into it. Many of the others were pretty lurid anti-German. Speaker division. First of all, the long talks part. Remember, this is the end of the period when you still have the 2-hour-long orator. So they could go out and talk for long periods of time on patriotic subjects. Then you have the 4-minute man. Quoted number is 75,000 of them. This was thought up by a young man in Chicago who went to DC, buttonholed Creel, got him to agree to it. You'd have a coordinator in all the major cities. People would apply to become 4-minute men. You'd be checked to find out if you really could deliver verbally. And then what you would do is, wherever you could find, started out in movie theaters, but went everywhere. You waited until an intermission. In the movie theaters, it was the period when the projectionist was changing reels of film, and you delivered a 4-minute long propaganda patriotic speech. Now, the CPI would put out speaking points about every 2 weeks. And you just had bullet points, but you would also get an example script on the subject. And human nature being what it is, I'll bet you a lot of those scripts ended up being just read. Creel says 750,000 speeches. That doesn't make sense to me. And he himself admits it's probably an incomplete number. If you have 75,000 volunteers, that means only 10 speeches per volunteer over a period of about 18 months. I saw another reference that said 7.5 million speeches. I think that's probably too much. There were a lot of speeches. We really don't know how many. Did they have an effect? Probably. But there are no metrics that let us measure that. Now, the official bulletin, this was a rather unique thing, never been quite reproduced. Woodrow Wilson gave Creel a direct order that he was to produce a publication that included everything that the government was doing relative to the war. You can see there on the cover the various bits and pieces that went into it. What Creel actually had to do is he put people at each of those governmental organizations who would go around every day and find out what new publications, rules, changes, whatever were being put out. It would get fed back to a central office and then would be put into the bulletin. They started out with the bulletin going out for free. The newspapers complained because they thought it was competing with them. So it was made a subscription publication at $5 a year. That's about $100 in today's money. And apparently all the newspapers still went ahead and subscribed to it. One of the things that's a little bit unusual is all the casualty lists went into it. Now, casualty lists to start with were name and rank of the casualty, next of kin's name and address. All of a sudden, the War Department quit giving anything except the name and rank. When they went and said why, somebody in the War Department decided it was possible that one of those 200,000 German agents would go to the next of kin, find out things about the casualty, that the kin could be sent back somehow or another to Berlin, and then used front lines to damage the war effort. And a lot of questions were asked like, where's the 200,000 agents? What information are they going to get? How in the world do they get it back to Berlin? And by then, it's probably 3 months after the casualty, and somebody in the War Department basically said, oh, and went back to doing it the other way. This thing started at 8 pages and went to 32. And by the time it peaked in the summer of 1918, 118,000 copies were going out to libraries, official reading rooms around the country, newspapers, governmental organizations, you name it. Pamphlets and flyers. They claim to have printed 75 million copies. There's some of the titles. You'll notice Wilson's numbers are pretty big. The Flag Day address gets so many because that was considered the statement of official U.S. war aims. It was a speech he delivered on the 14th of June, 1917. Went out in multiple languages all over the world. Some of them were quite large. They would put out one called the War Cyclopedia, which is 200 pages long. They also put out a bunch of very short ones called the patriotism flyers. Pictorial Division, they went and got big names for this. It was headed by Charles Dana Gibson, artist who came up with the Gibson Girl. They included people like N.C. Wyeth, one of the biggest artists in the North American continent, Howard Chandler Christie, who did our John Barclay portrait, of course, James Montgomery Flagg, and Uncle Sam. And they did all sorts of things. 1,500 posters, mostly in the U.S., although some versions of them went overseas. Lots of newspaper installations and other things. If you could draw it, they did it. There was also a photographic division, and there was a division of cartoons. And some of the cartoons are absolutely vicious. What they do for themes, same kind of thing that you might have seen from the British, except put into American context. On the home front, British said, don't eat 2 slices of bread. We say, eat corn. And finally, the standard German evil stuff. The one on the far right side, I looked at that and said, you have got to be kidding me. However, the interesting one is the one on the upper left. That is a publicity poster for a privately produced motion picture in 1918 called The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin. The film itself is considered lost. There are no known existing prints of it, but there are descriptions. And it's about as overacted, overblown, overheated a piece of silent movie, and they overacted anyway, work as you can imagine. The Kaiser is portrayed as this greedy conqueror. At one point, a German officer who still has a little bit of honor in his bones slaps the Kaiser and then commits suicide. When the Germans invade Belgium, there is a Belgian blacksmith who saves his daughter from the intentions of a German soldier. The blacksmith is Elmo Lincoln, who later becomes Tarzan. And by the end of the war, which of course hasn't occurred when this movie comes out, the Kaiser is now imprisoned in Belgium, and his jailer is none other than the blacksmith. The U-boat outrage, by the way, if you can't see it, at the German feet are drowned women and children. They also had voluntary press censorship in the U.S. CPI was not supposed, they didn't want to do it, but they offered the guidelines. That's the official title. It comes on a card, and it's really rather reasonable in terms of what you can't publish. But at times, the censorship got a lot worse. Formally, Post Office and Justice did it. There was a censorship committee. Creel was part of it, not really happily, but a part of it. And of course, they used the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Post Office, basically, the Post Office Postmaster General just said, if I don't like it, we don't mail it. And a lot of publications disappeared as a result. American press at the front. I already talked about the British and French and their limited numbers. We drove them nuts. We sent 80 in the first batch, all over the place. Now, they were subject to military censors, and there are a lot of complaints about not being able to get stories filed. But still, the idea was we're going to tell everybody American about Americans. A lot of international programs. And one thing we did differently from the British and the French and the Germans, for that matter, is when the CPI sent somebody into a country, they went to that country's government saying, we want to set up an information office, and they did it publicly and openly. They then fed all this stuff to the press in that country. All kinds of subjects, all kinds of languages, reasonably successful. But again, there are no metrics for determining whether or not it had any real impact on the conduct of any of these countries. Some places, like in Russia, it got to be a real adventure of survival, particularly after the Bolsheviks get into power. Allied cooperation, there were coordination committees in London, Paris, and Padua. However, basically, the US wanted to talk about things like self-determination and peace without victory, and nobody else wanted to hear any of that. And after a fairly short time, CPI people just quit going to these committee meetings because there wasn't any point in it. The Europeans were not prepared to listen. A couple of US leaflets. There's another one of these. This one shows the American strength on the far left there, the little bitty guy, 1917, then the strength in the summer of 1918, 1,750,000, which probably puts it like June or July 1918. And finally, a warning, 1919, we're going to have 5 million. And what must be the absolute last leaflets of the war, one of the relatively few American ones that's all words. Germany has left, Austria has left the war. Turkey has surrendered. Germany is alone. The whole world knows that the war is over. So I would say this is sometime between the 4th of November and the 11th of November, 1918. Were they effective? German soldiers could be punished rather severely for having one in their possession. But there are claims that up to 60% of the Germans who line crossed had one, some kind of a flyer. Domestic operation of the CPI quit on Armistice Day. Foreign operations waited until the next summer because Creel and a small group went to Paris with Wilson. The whole thing was officially abolished by act of Congress on August 21st, 1919. The files were put away in the archives and sort of disappeared for a long time. Creel went back to civilian life, but he stayed active in Democratic Party politics for pretty much the rest of his life. Was never politically active in any significant way since. Aftermath. Well, criticism of the CPI after the war for quite a long time was based on the fact that it was just too much and not always truthful and rather overheated. Some of the complaints about the many of the stories that got passed straight through the Brits were very bitter. World War II, the U.S. Office of War Information turned out to be about a second-line governmental organization that never even approached the degree of influence or the degree of centralization the CPI had. In the UK, well, somewhat the same kind of criticism. The business of the atrocity tales, which was even worse in British use than in ours, really got very, very sharp after the war. When you had a Ministry of Information in World War II, it was so bad that they were gun shy for atrocity tales. And the result was that even when information about the Holocaust became available, they tended to avoid publicizing it until troops actually began to find the concentration camps. We might have been able to do something more had it not happened the way it did. Finally, in Germany, well, there were a couple of people in Germany who thought that German propaganda was wimpish and ineffective, and that Allied propaganda was very effective. One of them was Ludendorff, and a gentleman with the toothbrush mustache was the other one. These are some of the principles he came up with based on his assessment of the effectiveness of propaganda. And of course, when he gets into power, the Ministry of Information under Herr Goebbels is anything but uncoordinated. And truth has nothing to do with it. One more thing. I couldn't resist this. This is a Russian image. And if the mustache and the spiked helmet don't show that it's Kaiser Wilhelm, his name is printed on his chest. The caption at the bottom says, "The enemy of the human race." The caption above his right hand with the skull says, "The majority of the people ruthlessly killed." The other side says, "Many cities viciously destroyed." By his right leg is the French city of Reims, and by his left leg is the Belgian city of Louvain. And just to be sure that everybody understands it, written on his tail, curling down, are the words German malice. That, folks, is the ultimate demonization. And that concludes my talk today.
Lee, that was memorable. That put together an amazing amount of stuff there, and it's just great. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you, and thanks again for listening to us.
Thanks, everybody.